A warm cup of coffee sat abandoned on a windowsill, steam still rising from its surface. On an easel nearby, wet paint glistened on a half-finished canvas, a desert landscape that would never be completed. The front door hung open to the August heat, and a pair of sandals sat neatly aligned by the entrance, as if their owner had simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. This was how Celeste Hawthorne's life ended, not with violence or screaming, but with an ordinary morning frozen in time, waiting for someone who would never return. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Celeste was 23 years old when she disappeared from the small Arizona town of Copper Ridge on August 15, 1988. She had everything going for her: a teaching job she loved, artistic talent that impressed everyone who saw her work, and the kind of natural beauty that made people stop and stare. Her auburn hair caught the desert sunlight like fire, and her green eyes held the kind of warmth that made children trust her instantly. But Celeste was running from something. She had arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years earlier, with little more than art supplies and a desperate need for a fresh start. The town suited her perfectly. Small enough that everyone knew everyone, but far enough from civilization that questions about the past didn't come up very often. She rented a modest adobe house on Saguaro Street from Vernon Kestrel, a retired rancher who had known heartbreak himself. Vernon would later tell police that Celeste was the kind of tenant every landlord dreams of. Quiet, responsible, and she always paid her rent 3 days early. She kept to herself mostly, but not in an unfriendly way. She'd wave to neighbors, help Mrs. Valdez across the street with her groceries, and every few weeks she'd leave a small painting on someone's doorstep with a note that simply said, "Hope this brightens your day." The children at Copper Ridge Elementary School worshipped her. Unlike other teachers who saw art class as a break from real learning, Celeste treated every crayon drawing and finger painting like it belonged in a museum. She would spend her own money on supplies, staying late to prepare lessons that would spark creativity in even the most reluctant students. "She made us feel like real artists," 9-year-old Tommy Martinez would tell his mother years later. "She said everyone has something beautiful inside them, they just need to find the right way to let it out." But on the morning of August 15, 1988, Celeste Hawthorne didn't show up for the first day of the new school year. Principal Margaret Holloway called her house at 7:30 a.m. when Celeste failed to arrive for the morning staff meeting. No answer. She called again at 8:15 a.m. when students began asking where their favorite teacher was. Still nothing. By 10 a.m., Margaret was genuinely worried. Celeste wasn't the type to miss work without calling, especially not on the first day of school. During lunch break, School Secretary Dolores Finch drove to Celeste's house to check on her. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The front door was unlocked, not just unlocked, but standing slightly open, as if someone had stepped outside for just a moment and forgot to close it behind them. Dolores called out from the porch, but got no response. After a few minutes of hesitation, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house felt wrong immediately. Not because anything was missing or damaged, but because everything was so perfectly normal. Celeste's purse sat on the kitchen counter, car keys visible inside the open zipper. Her coffee mug, the blue one with sunflowers that she used every morning, sat on the windowsill with coffee still warm enough to steam. The bed was unmade in a way that suggested someone had just gotten up. A piece of toast sat on a plate, one bite taken out of it. But it was the painting that really stopped Dolores cold. Celeste's easel stood in the living room, holding a canvas with a half-finished desert landscape. The paint was still wet, so fresh that when Dolores accidentally brushed against it with her sleeve, it smeared. This wasn't a painting from yesterday or last week. This was a painting that had been worked on within the hour. Most disturbing of all were the sandals by the front door. They were aligned perfectly, the way someone would place them if they planned to slip back into them in just a few minutes. But there were no other shoes missing from Celeste's closet. Had she left the house barefoot, in the Arizona desert heat? That made no sense at all. Dolores backed out of the house and drove straight to the sheriff's office, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She had lived in Copper Ridge for 43 years and had never seen anything like this. People didn't just vanish from their morning routine. They didn't leave coffee growing cold and paintings half-finished and doors hanging open to the desert heat. But Celeste Hawthorne had. Within an hour, the house was swarming with deputies and volunteers. They searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They interviewed neighbors, checked the local hospital, called every business in town to see if anyone had seen her. They examined the house for signs of forced entry or struggle. There were none. No broken windows, no disturbed furniture, no drops of blood or torn clothing. The house looked exactly like someone had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgot to come back. Except that moment had stretched into hours, and those hours were becoming a day, and that day was becoming the beginning of a mystery that would consume an entire community. The most experienced investigators would later say they had never seen anything like it. When people disappear, there are usually signs, evidence of a struggle, a hasty departure, some indication of what happened. But Celeste's house offered no clues, no trail to follow, no obvious place to start looking for answers. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and into thin air. The volunteers searched until sunset, calling her name across the desert, checking every arroyo and hidden canyon within miles of town. But the desert kept its secrets, and when darkness fell on August 15, 1988, Celeste Hawthorne had been missing for over 12 hours, with no trace of where she might have gone or why she might have left. That night, as search teams prepared to resume their efforts in the morning, nobody could have guessed that they were looking at the beginning of a mystery that would span 3 decades, destroy multiple lives, and ultimately reveal that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we trust the most. Sometimes, the people who promise to protect us are the very ones we should fear. And sometimes the last person you'd suspect is the first person you should investigate. Detective Raymond Blackwood had seen enough missing persons cases to know that the first 24 hours were everything. After that, the chances of finding someone alive dropped dramatically, and the chances of finding them at all became a matter of luck more than skill. He arrived at Celeste's house at 3:47 p.m. on August 15th, driving his battered Ford pickup through the growing crowd of volunteers and curiosity seekers. At 56 years old, Blackwood had the kind of weathered face that came from 26 years of police work in Arizona. Deep lines around steel-gray eyes that had seen too much, hands that were permanently stained with desert dust and other people's tragedies. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The Coconino County Sheriff's Department didn't get many missing persons cases. Most of the time, when someone disappeared in rural Arizona, it was because they wanted to disappear. Husbands running from child support, wives escaping abusive marriages, teenagers who thought the big city would be better than small-town life. Usually they turned up within a week, either coming home on their own or getting arrested somewhere for vagrancy or petty theft. But something about the scene at Celeste Hawthorne's house made Blackwood's instincts scream that this was different. He spent an hour walking through the house alone, not touching anything, just observing. The warm coffee mug bothered him. In his experience, people who planned to leave didn't start making coffee first. They didn't take one bite of toast and abandon it on the counter. They didn't leave wet paint on canvases that would be ruined if left to dry unfinished. The front door bothered him even more. It wasn't just unlocked, it was open, as if someone had stepped outside expecting to return in minutes. But there were no signs that anyone had ever come back, no footprints in the dust, no indication that the door had been closed and reopened. "Tell me about her routine," Blackwood said to Principal Margaret Holloway, who had driven over from the school to answer questions. Margaret was a thin woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of nervous energy that came from running an elementary school for 15 years. She was very consistent, Margaret said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the heat. Always arrived at school by 7:15, had her coffee, and reviewed her lesson plans before the other teachers got there. She took her job seriously, detective. She wouldn't just not show up. Any problems lately? Boyfriend troubles? Money issues? Nothing like that. Celeste kept to herself mostly, but she seemed happy. She was excited about the new school year, had all these plans for art projects with the children. Blackwood made notes in his pocket notebook, the same one he'd carried for 8 years. What about her past? Family back east? Margaret hesitated. She didn't talk about her family much. I got the impression there had been some kind of falling out, maybe with her parents. She mentioned once that she came to Arizona to make a fresh start, but she never gave details. That was another red flag. In Blackwood's experience, people who needed fresh starts were usually running from something. The question was whether that something had finally caught up with Celeste Hawthorne. By evening, the search effort had grown to include over 200 volunteers. The local fire department brought floodlights, and several ranchers contributed horses and ATVs to cover more ground. They searched every building in town, every abandoned structure within a 10-mile radius, every place a person could hide or be hidden. Mrs. Esperanza Valdez, who lived across the street from Celeste, was the only neighbor who reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. She told Blackwood that around 10 p.m. the night before, August 14th, she had heard voices coming from Celeste's house. It sounded like an argument, Mrs. Valdez said in heavily accented English. A man's voice, very angry. I couldn't make out the words, but he was shouting at someone. How long did this go on? Maybe 5-10 minutes. Then it got quiet again. Did you see anyone leave the house? Mrs. Valdez shook her head. I was watching my telenovelas. I didn't look outside until later, but I didn't see any cars or anything. Blackwood spent the next several hours canvassing the neighborhood, but no one else had heard the argument Mrs. Valdez described. Either they had been asleep, watching television, or simply hadn't paid attention to what they might have dismissed as a normal domestic dispute. The lack of evidence was maddening. No signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, no witnesses who saw Celeste leave her house either voluntarily or against her will. Her car was still in the driveway, keys in her purse. Her bank account showed no recent activity. Her credit cards hadn't been used since a purchase at Morrison's grocery store 3 days earlier. Milk, bread, and art supplies. As the sun set on August 15th, and search teams prepared to continue their efforts by flashlight, Blackwood stood in Celeste's living room and tried to understand what he was looking at. The wet paint on the canvas had dried now, leaving the desert landscape forever unfinished. The coffee had gone cold, the toast had hardened on the plate. Everything suggested that Celeste had been in the middle of an ordinary morning routine when something happened to interrupt it. But what? And where was she now? The volunteers worked through the night, their voices calling her name across the empty desert. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions every hour. The Arizona Department of Public Safety issued a missing person alert that went out to law enforcement agencies across the state. But as dawn broke on August 16th, Celeste Hawthorne had been missing for over 24 hours, and nobody had any idea where she was or what had happened to her. Blackwood had handled enough cases to know that people didn't usually vanish without leaving some kind of trail. They took clothes, money, identification. They told someone where they were going, even if they lied about it. They left evidence of their intentions, their fears, their plans. Celeste had left nothing but questions and a house frozen in time, waiting for someone who would never return. In small towns, when someone disappears, the whole community feels the loss. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone has theories about what might have happened. But theories weren't evidence, and evidence was exactly what Detective Blackwood didn't have. What he did have was a growing certainty that Celeste Hawthorne hadn't left voluntarily, and that whoever was responsible for her disappearance was either very lucky or very smart. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who know exactly how to make someone disappear without leaving a trace. And sometimes, the most innocent-looking crime scenes hide the darkest secrets. The second day of searching brought no answers, only more questions that nobody wanted to ask out loud. How does a 23-year-old woman vanish from her own home without taking anything with her? How does someone disappear so completely that even the best tracker dogs lose the scent at her front door? Detective Blackwood spent August 16th conducting the kind of thorough background investigation that small-town police departments rarely had to do. In a place like Copper Ridge, most crimes were simple: bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional theft. People didn't just evaporate from their morning routines, but as he dug deeper into Celeste Hawthorne's life, Blackwood discovered that the young art teacher had been more mysterious than anyone realized. Her employment file at the school contained the basic information: previous address in Ohio, teaching credentials, emergency contact listing her parents. But when Blackwood called the phone number listed for Harold and Janet Hawthorne in Cleveland, he got a recording saying the number had been disconnected. Directory assistants had no listing for anyone by that name in the Cleveland area. The address she had given as her previous residence turned out to be a small apartment complex in a rundown section of the city. The manager there remembered a young woman who matched Celeste's description, but she had paid rent in cash and kept to herself. More importantly, she had left suddenly in the middle of the night without giving notice or collecting her security deposit. She was here for about 8 months, the manager told Blackwood over the phone. Quiet girl, no trouble. Then one day she was just gone. Left most of her furniture behind too. Before we continue with these disturbing revelations, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The bank where Celeste had opened her account in Copper Ridge provided another piece of the puzzle. She had arrived with a cashier's check for $3,147. Not enough money to suggest she was wealthy, but too much for someone who supposedly left Ohio in a hurry. The check had been issued by a bank in Columbus, not Cleveland, which raised more questions about her real background. Vernon Kestrel, her landlord, had noticed things about Celeste that he hadn't mentioned during the initial investigation. She never received mail from family or friends back east. She paid her rent in cash, always exact change, as if she had calculated her expenses down to the penny. Most telling of all, she had specifically asked for a rental agreement that could be terminated with 30 days' notice, no questions asked. Looking back, it was like she was always ready to run, Vernon told Blackwood. Not in a suspicious way, but like someone who had learned not to get too comfortable anywhere. The search for Celeste had expanded to include the entire county, with volunteers organized into grid patterns that covered hundreds of square miles of desert. Local businesses donated food and water for the searchers, and several churches opened their doors as coordination centers. But despite the massive effort, nobody had found so much as a footprint leading away from her house. Principal Margaret Holloway had become the unofficial spokesperson for the search effort, organizing volunteers and dealing with the media attention that was starting to attract reporters from Phoenix and Flagstaff. She spoke passionately about Celeste's dedication to her students and her plans for the new school year. She had these wonderful ideas for teaching the children about desert wildlife through art, Margaret told a reporter from Channel 12 News. She was going to have them paint landscapes and learn about the animals that live in them. The children are asking every day when Miss Hawthorne is coming back. But even Margaret had noticed things about Celeste that seemed unusual in hindsight. The young teacher had never mentioned family plans for holidays or summer vacation. She had never talked about visiting home or having relatives visit her. When other teachers shared stories about their backgrounds and childhood memories, Celeste would listen politely, but never contribute similar stories of her own. "I thought she was just private," Margaret explained to Blackwood. "Some people don't like to share personal details, but now I wonder if there was more to it than that." The investigation into Celeste's finances revealed another mystery. Her teaching salary was modest. but her bank account showed regular deposits that were slightly larger than her paychecks should have been. When Blackwood asked the school district's payroll department about this, they confirmed that Celeste was paid exactly what her contract specified. No overtime, no extra duties, no additional income from the school. So where was the extra money coming from? The answer came from Rita Morrison, who owned Morrison's grocery store where Celeste had made her last known purchase. Rita remembered that Celeste occasionally sold small paintings to tourists who stopped in town on their way to the Grand Canyon. She'd bring in these little desert scenes, maybe 6 inches by 8 inches, Rita explained. I'd display them near the register, and tourists would buy them as souvenirs. She was real talented. I probably sold 2 or 3 a month for her, maybe $25 each. But even that income wouldn't account for the extra money in Celeste's account. Blackwood was starting to suspect that the young art teacher had been involved in something she hadn't told anyone about. Possibly something that explained why she had left Ohio so suddenly and why she seemed always ready to run again. The phone calls to potential witnesses and former acquaintances painted a picture of a woman who had been deliberately erasing her past. Her former neighbors in Ohio described her as polite but distant. Former co-workers at a Columbus art supply store where she had worked briefly remembered her as competent but secretive about her personal life. Most disturbing of all was a conversation Blackwood had with Dr. Patricia Wells, a counselor at a women's crisis center in Columbus. While she couldn't discuss specific cases due to confidentiality rules, Dr. Wells confirmed that someone matching Celeste's description had attended several support group meetings for survivors of family violence. I can't give you details, Dr. Wells said carefully, but I can tell you that some of our clients find it necessary to completely reinvent themselves for their own safety. New names, new locations, new identities, it's more common than people realize. As the second day of searching came to an end with no sign of Celeste, Blackwood realized he wasn't just looking for a missing person anymore. He was looking for someone who had already disappeared once before and might have been forced to disappear again. The question was whether this time she had disappeared by choice or because someone had made that choice for her. 3 days into the investigation, Detective Blackwood was running on coffee and determination. The massive search effort had covered nearly 300 square miles of desert without finding so much as a piece of clothing or a footprint. The media attention was growing, and pressure from the county sheriff to show progress was mounting. Blackwood had worked missing persons cases before, but none that felt so completely without direction. He was at his desk at 11:47 p.m. on August 18th, going through witness statements for what felt like the 100th time, when his phone rang. Detective Blackwood? The voice was strange, hollow and distorted, as if the caller was speaking through some kind of tunnel or mask. This is Blackwood. Who is this? There was a pause, just long enough for Blackwood to grab a pen and start writing. The voice that came back was barely above a whisper, each word carefully pronounced. She trusted the wrong person. Blackwood's blood went cold. What? Who is this? Do you know something about Celeste Hawthorne? Check the mine. What mine? Which mine? There are dozens of mines out here. Hello? Hello? The line went dead. Blackwood immediately called the dispatcher to request a trace on the call. But in 1988, phone tracing technology was limited, especially in rural Arizona. The best they could do was determine that the call had come from a payphone, and even that would take several hours to confirm. Before we continue with this chilling development, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. While waiting for the trace results, Blackwood replayed the conversation in his mind. The voice had been male, he was certain of that, but there was something artificial about it. Not just the distortion, but the way the words were spoken. Too careful, too deliberate, like someone reading from a script or trying to disguise their natural speech pattern. She trusted the wrong person. That phrase suggested the caller knew something specific about Celeste's disappearance. It implied that she had been betrayed by someone she knew, someone she had reason to trust. But who? And why would this person call to provide information? Check the mine. Copper Ridge had been a mining town in the early 1900s. The surrounding desert was honeycombed with abandoned copper and silver mines, some of them hundreds of feet deep. Most had been sealed by the state decades ago, but many others remained open, dangerous shafts that claimed the lives of curious teenagers and careless hikers every few years. By morning, the trace results came back. The call had been made from a payphone outside a Texaco station on the outskirts of Flagstaff, 40 miles north of Copper Ridge. Blackwood drove there immediately and interviewed the night shift attendant, but the man remembered nothing unusual about late-night phone calls. The payphone was in a poorly lit area behind the building, and anyone could have used it without being seen from inside the station. The reference to mines galvanized the search effort in a new direction. Local mining experts were brought in to identify which abandoned shafts were deep enough to hide a body, but accessible enough for someone to reach without specialized equipment. The list was sobering. Over 30 locations within a reasonable driving distance of Celeste's house. Mine searches were incredibly dangerous work. Most of the shafts were unstable, with walls that could collapse without warning. The summer heat made extended searches nearly impossible, and many of the mines contained pockets of toxic gas that had built up over decades. The county couldn't risk sending volunteers into such hazardous conditions. Professional rescue teams from Phoenix and Flagstaff were called in with proper equipment, ropes, gas detectors, communication systems, and medical support. The first mine they searched was the old Copper Crown shaft, less than 5 miles from town. It took a full day to safely explore the main tunnel and several side passages. They found nothing but rusted mining equipment and the occasional animal bones. The second mine, known locally as Lucky Strike, was deeper and more complex. The search team spent 2 days mapping the tunnels and checking every accessible area. Again, nothing. As word of the anonymous tip spread through the community, theories began to flourish. Some people believed the caller was the kidnapper himself, playing games with police. Others thought it might be an accomplice who was having second thoughts. A few suspected it was just a cruel prank by someone seeking attention. Margaret Holloway organized a prayer vigil at the school on the evening of August 21st. Over 500 people attended, holding candles and sharing memories of Celeste. Parents spoke about how much their children loved their art teacher. Fellow teachers described her dedication and creativity. Vernon Kestrel talked about what a good tenant she had been. "We're not giving up," Margaret told the crowd, her voice breaking slightly. "Celeste is part of our family, and we don't abandon family. We're going to keep searching until we bring her home." But privately, even the most optimistic volunteers were beginning to accept that they might not be searching for a living person anymore. A week had passed since Celeste's disappearance, and the Arizona desert in August was merciless. Even if she had somehow become lost or trapped somewhere, survival without water for this long was nearly impossible. The mine searches continued for 2 weeks, with teams exploring every shaft they could safely access. They found equipment caches left by miners decades ago, illegal campsites used by transients, and evidence that some of the mines were being used for drug manufacturing. But they found no trace of Celeste Hawthorne. Blackwood became obsessed with the anonymous caller. He had the brief conversation transcribed and analyzed by language experts, hoping to identify regional accents or speech patterns. He played the recording for everyone who had known Celeste, asking if the voice sounded familiar. He even brought in a sound engineer from Phoenix to see if the distortion could be removed or clarified. Nothing worked. The voice remained a mystery, and the caller never contacted police again, despite repeated appeals through local media. As August turned to September, the massive volunteer search effort gradually scaled back. People had jobs to return to, children starting school, normal lives that had been put on hold during the crisis. The professional rescue teams completed their survey of accessible mines and moved on to other emergencies. Detective Blackwood kept the case active, following up on every tip and lead no matter how unlikely. He interviewed drifters and transients, checked with law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, and maintained contact with agencies that specialized in missing persons cases. But as 1988 turned to 1989 and then to 1990, the Celeste Hawthorne case gradually joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that haunted small police departments across rural America. The anonymous phone call became the most frustrating piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Someone out there knew what had happened to Celeste, knew enough to direct police toward the mines. But that same person had chosen to remain hidden, offering just enough information to torment investigators without providing anything useful. Years later, Blackwood would still wake up some nights hearing that distorted voice. She trusted the wrong person. Check the mine. He never stopped wondering who had made that call and why they had chosen to reach out in the darkness only to disappear back into silence. Sometimes the people who claim to want to help are the ones who have the most to hide. And sometimes a single phone call can haunt an investigation for decades, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it conceals. The mine searches that followed the anonymous phone call represented the largest rescue operation in Coconino County history. Professional teams from across Arizona converged on Copper Ridge, bringing equipment that most locals had never seen: industrial-strength winches, gas detection monitors, and communication systems that could reach hundreds of feet underground. Captain Mike Rodriguez of the Phoenix Fire Department's technical rescue team had been exploring dangerous mines for 15 years, but even he was impressed by the scope of what they were facing. The area around Copper Ridge contained over 60 abandoned mining operations, ranging from simple prospect holes barely deep enough for a person to stand in, to complex networks of tunnels that stretched for miles underground. Some of these mines go down 400 or 500 feet, Rodriguez explained to Detective Blackwood as they surveyed their first target location. The main shafts are usually stable enough, but the side tunnels can collapse if you look at them wrong, and that's not even considering the gas buildup. Before we continue with this dangerous search operation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The first priority was determining which mines were physically accessible to someone without professional equipment. Many of the older shafts had been sealed with concrete barriers or steel grating, installed by the state in the 1960s after several hikers fell to their deaths. But budget constraints and the remote locations meant that dozens of mines remained completely open. The rescue teams developed a systematic approach. Each mine was first surveyed from the surface using portable winches and cameras. If the initial exploration showed the shaft was stable enough for human entry, a two-person team would descend to check the main tunnel and any visible side passages. The work was incredibly slow and dangerous. Desert heat made surface operations nearly unbearable during daylight hours, so most of the actual mine entries had to be done in early morning or evening. Each descent required extensive safety protocols, gas monitoring, redundant communication systems, and rescue personnel standing by at the surface. The community response to the mine searches was extraordinary. Local businesses donated food, water, and equipment. The Red Cross set up a coordination center at the high school. Volunteer firefighters from surrounding counties came to assist with surface operations and crowd control. Martha Chen, who ran the Desert Rose Diner, started providing free meals for all the rescue workers. "These people are risking their lives to find our teacher," she said simply. "The least we can do is make sure they're fed." But as the days passed and mine after mine yielded nothing, the operation began to feel increasingly hopeless. The rescue teams were professional and thorough, but they were also realistic about the odds of finding anything after so much time had passed. Some of the mines contained evidence of recent human activity: makeshift camps used by transients, drug paraphernalia, graffiti left by teenagers looking for adventure. But none of it appeared connected to Celeste's disappearance. The most promising lead came at the old Silverado mine, about 8 miles southeast of town. The main shaft descended nearly 200 feet before opening into a large chamber that had been carved out during the mining boom of 1907. When the rescue team reached the bottom, they found something that made everyone's pulse quicken: A piece of blue fabric caught on a rock projection about 50 feet down. Celeste had been wearing a blue blouse on the day she disappeared. The fabric was carefully extracted and sent to the state crime lab in Phoenix for analysis. For 3 days, the entire investigation focused on that single piece of cloth. If it matched Celeste's clothing, it would be the first physical evidence that she had been in one of the mines. The results were devastating. The fabric was cotton, but it was from a man's work shirt, not a woman's blouse. Carbon dating suggested it had been in the mine for at least 10 years, probably left by a miner or maintenance worker long before Celeste had even arrived in Arizona. False hope was almost worse than no hope at all. The psychological toll on the rescue workers was becoming evident. These were people trained to find survivors, to pull victims from collapsed buildings and flooded rivers. Searching mine after mine with no results went against every instinct they had developed in their careers. "That's the worst kind of search," Rodriguez confided to Blackwood after 2 weeks of fruitless exploration. "Usually we're racing against time to save someone. Here, we don't even know if there's anyone to save." Local volunteers were struggling with the same frustration. Many had taken time off work or arranged childcare to participate in the searches. They had hiked miles of desert, checked every building and cave within a 20-mile radius, and followed up on hundreds of tips and alleged sightings. The mine searches represented their last, best hope of finding answers. When those searches produced nothing, the reality began to set in that Celeste Hawthorne might never be found. Principal Margaret Holloway tried to maintain morale among the volunteers, but she was fighting her own battles with despair. School had started without Celeste, and every day brought reminders of her absence. Children asked when their art teacher was coming back. Parents wanted to know if it was safe to let their kids walk to school alone. "We have to believe she's out there somewhere," Margaret told a gathering of search volunteers on September 1st. "We can't give up on her. She wouldn't give up on any of us." But privately, even Margaret was beginning to accept that the massive search effort might never provide the answers everyone desperately wanted. The mine searches officially concluded on September 15, 1988, after exploring 37 different sites. The rescue teams had descended over 3 miles of tunnel systems, photographed every accessible chamber, and collected dozens of samples for analysis. They had found old equipment, animal remains, evidence of illegal activities, and the accumulated debris of decades of abandonment. But they had found no trace of Celeste Hawthorne. The anonymous caller's tip about checking the mines had led to the most comprehensive underground search in Arizona history, but it had also consumed thousands of hours of professional time and community volunteer effort without producing any useful evidence. Detective Blackwood stood at the edge of the last mine shaft as the rescue teams packed up their equipment. Somewhere out there, Celeste Hawthorne was waiting to be found. But after a month of searching, he was no closer to understanding what had happened to her than he had been on the first day. Sometimes the bravest thing people can do is keep searching when they know the search might be hopeless. And sometimes the most painful lesson is learning that not every mystery has a solution that can be found. By October 1988, the massive search operation that had consumed Copper Ridge for over a month was winding down like a clock running out of power. The professional rescue teams had returned to Phoenix and Flagstaff. The Red Cross Coordination Center at the high school had been dismantled. The media trucks that had crowded Main Street for weeks were gone, chasing fresher stories in bigger cities. But for Detective Raymond Blackwood, the end of the organized search effort marked the beginning of a different kind of torment. He couldn't let go of the case. While other investigations demanded his attention, domestic disputes, theft reports, the occasional drug bust, Blackwood found himself returning obsessively to the growing stack of files labeled Hawthorne, Celeste, Missing Person. Every few days, a new tip would come in. Someone thought they had seen a woman matching Celeste's description at a truck stop in Flagstaff. A hiker claimed to have found a piece of clothing near one of the unexplored mines. A psychic from Sedona called to say she had visions of Celeste trapped in an underground chamber. Blackwood followed up on every single lead, no matter how unlikely. He drove hundreds of miles checking out reported sightings. He revisited mine sites that had already been thoroughly searched. He interviewed drifters and transients, showing Celeste's photograph to anyone who would look at it. His wife, Carol, began to worry about his health. He was losing weight, staying up late reading case files, talking in his sleep about voices in the darkness and abandoned coffee cups. "You're going to make yourself sick," she told him one evening as he sat at the kitchen table with crime scene photos spread around his dinner plate. "Ray, you've done everything humanly possible. Sometimes people just vanish." But Blackwood couldn't accept that explanation. In his 26 years of law enforcement, he had never encountered a case that offered so few clues. People didn't simply evaporate from their morning routines. Someone knew what had happened to Celeste Hawthorne, and that someone was still out there, living with their secret. Before we continue with this haunting investigation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The anonymous phone call particularly tormented him. He had the brief recording analyzed by every expert he could find. He played it for voice recognition specialists, linguistic experts, even a retired FBI profiler who specialized in anonymous communications. But the distorted quality of the recording made definitive analysis impossible. "She trusted the wrong person. Check the mine." Those 9 words contained the only direct clue about Celeste's fate, but they raised more questions than they answered. Why had the caller chosen to reach out? Why provide information at all if they weren't willing to be more specific? And why had they never called again? The community of Copper Ridge was struggling with its own form of trauma. The month-long search effort had brought the town together in extraordinary ways, but the lack of resolution left everyone feeling hollow and defeated. Neighbors who had worked side by side searching the desert now passed each other on the street with awkward nods, unsure what to say about their shared failure. The elementary school had hired a substitute art teacher, Mrs. Helen Bradley, a retired woman from Flagstaff who commuted to Copper Ridge 3 days a week. She was competent and kind, but the children frequently asked when Miss Hawthorne was coming back. Some of the younger students refused to believe that their beloved teacher was really gone. "She's just hiding," 6-year-old Rosie Valdez insisted to her mother. "She's going to come back and surprise us with new art projects." Principal Margaret Holloway found herself dealing with parents who were frightened about their children's safety. Some families had installed new locks and security systems. Others were considering moving away from Copper Ridge entirely, unable to feel safe in a place where someone could simply disappear without explanation. "This used to be the kind of town where nobody locked their doors," Margaret told Blackwood during one of his regular check-ins at the school. "Now people are afraid to let their children walk to school alone. Celeste's disappearance has changed something fundamental about who we are." The media attention had brought unwanted scrutiny to the small town. Reporters had dug into every aspect of Copper Ridge's history, interviewing longtime residents about crime rates and community dynamics. Some of the coverage suggested that the town's isolation and insular nature might have enabled whatever had happened to Celeste. Local business owner Frank Morrison noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. "Tourists used to stop here on their way to the Grand Canyon," he said. "Friendly place, they'd say. Safe place to stretch your legs and grab a cold drink. Now people drive right through. They've heard about the missing teacher, and they don't want to stay anywhere that kind of thing can happen." As winter approached, Detective Blackwood realized he was fighting a losing battle against time and public attention. The Coconino County Sheriff was under pressure to focus resources on active cases rather than a months-old missing person investigation with no new leads. But Blackwood made a promise to himself that he would keep the case files, would continue following up on tips and leads even after the official investigation was scaled back. Somewhere out there, Celeste Hawthorne was waiting to be found, and someone knew what had happened to her. The truth was patient. It could wait years or even decades for the right moment to surface, and when it did, Blackwood intended to be ready. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just teaches us to carry them differently, to live with questions that may never be answered and hope that may never be fulfilled. But giving up on justice means giving up on the people who need it most, even when they can no longer ask for it themselves. Detective Raymond Blackwood retired from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department on March 15, 1995, after 29 years of service. His farewell party was held at the VFW Hall in Copper Ridge, with deputies, city officials, and community members gathering to honor his decades of dedication to public safety. But even as colleagues shared stories of cases solved and criminals caught, everyone in the room knew which case had haunted Blackwood's final years on the force. The Celeste Hawthorne investigation had consumed him in ways that worried his family and friends. He had never stopped following leads, never stopped hoping for a breakthrough that might finally provide answers. In his home office, Blackwood had assembled what amounted to a private archive of the case. Photocopies of every report, interview transcript, and piece of evidence filled 3 filing cabinets. Crime scene photographs covered one wall. A large map of the search area was marked with hundreds of colored pins, indicating locations that had been checked and rechecked over the years. His wife Carol had learned to live with her husband's obsession, but she worried about what retirement might do to him. At least while he was working, other cases provided distraction from the Hawthorne mystery. Now he would have unlimited time to focus on a case that seemed to have no solution. "You've got to find a way to let this go," she told him as he organized his case files for the 100th time. "Ray, you did everything possible. Some mysteries just can't be solved." But Blackwood couldn't accept that reality. 7 years had passed since Celeste's disappearance, and he still woke up some nights hearing that distorted voice. She trusted the wrong person. The official investigation had been scaled back in 1990, then officially closed in 1993 when the county declared Celeste legally dead. But Blackwood had continued working the case on his own time, using vacation days to follow leads and personal money to pay for gas when chasing down tips in distant cities. Before we continue with this personal journey, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The breakthrough that would change everything came in 2003, 15 years after Celeste had vanished. Harold and Janet Hoffman, who had been searching for their missing daughter Catherine for over a decade, finally saved enough money to hire a private investigator. They had never stopped believing that their daughter was alive somewhere, possibly living under a different name. The Hoffmans had spent their retirement savings on previous investigations that led nowhere, but they had heard about a former FBI agent named Marcus Thorne who specialized in cold missing persons cases. Thorne had a reputation for taking cases that other investigators considered hopeless. He used modern computer databases and networking techniques that hadn't been available to law enforcement in the 1980s. More importantly, he approached old cases with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the assumptions and theories that had guided previous investigations. The Hoffmans' first meeting with Thorne took place in a coffee shop in Columbus, Ohio. Harold was 73 years old, walking with a cane after a stroke 2 years earlier. Janet was 71, her hair completely gray, and her hands shaking from early-stage Parkinson's disease. They had been searching for their daughter for 15 years. "We know she changed her name," Janet explained, showing Thorne a folder of documents they had collected over the years. "We found the legal paperwork in 1986, right before she disappeared from Ohio. She became Celeste Hawthorne, but we don't know why or where she went." Harold added, "The police in Ohio said she was an adult and had the right to disappear if she wanted to. But Catherine wouldn't just abandon us without a word. Something happened to her." Thorne studied the documents they provided, the name change paperwork, Catherine's employment records, bank statements from her final months in Ohio. What he saw painted a picture of a young woman who had been systematically preparing to disappear. The name change had been processed through a lawyer in Cleveland who specialized in helping domestic violence victims establish new identities. Catherine had closed all her accounts, quit her job, and sold her car for cash in the weeks before she vanished. "This looks like someone who was running from something specific," Thorne told the Hoffmans. "The question is what or who?" Using databases that hadn't existed in 1988, Thorne was able to track the social security number associated with Catherine Hoffman's new identity. The trail led to Arizona, where records showed Celeste Hawthorne had lived in Copper Ridge from 1986 until 1988. That's when Thorne discovered that Catherine Hoffman and the missing Arizona teacher were the same person. "Your daughter didn't just disappear," Thorne told the Hoffmans during their second meeting. "She was the victim in a major missing persons investigation in Arizona. I've found newspaper coverage, police reports, even television news stories about her disappearance." For the first time in 15 years, Harold and Janet Hoffman had hoped that they might finally learn what had happened to their daughter. But they also realized that hope came with a terrible price: the growing certainty that Catherine had been the victim of a crime, not a young woman who had chosen to start over somewhere new. The weight of unsolved mysteries crushes families in ways that closure never could. For 15 years, the Hoffmans had lived with the possibility that their daughter was alive somewhere, angry at them or ashamed to come home. Now they faced the likelihood that she had been dead for over a decade. Sometimes the truth we've been searching for is more painful than the uncertainty we've been living with. But families who love missing people never stop hoping, never stop searching, even when hope feels like a burden too heavy to carry. Marcus Thorne had investigated over 200 missing persons cases during his 20-year career with the FBI, but few had presented as many layers of deception as the Catherine Hoffman investigation. As he delved deeper into her background, he discovered that the young woman who had disappeared from Arizona in 1988 had been living a carefully constructed lie for years before she vanished. The legal name change from Catherine Hoffman to Celeste Hawthorne had been just the beginning. Using specialized databases and cross-referencing techniques that hadn't been available to investigators in the 1980s, Thorne was able to reconstruct Catherine's final months in Ohio with startling clarity. She had been planning her escape for at least 6 months before she disappeared. Bank records showed systematic withdrawals designed to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. She had sold personal belongings through classified ads, always for cash. Most tellingly, she had been seen at the Cleveland Public Library multiple times, using their computers to research small towns in southwestern states where someone could start over without attracting attention. She was terrified of something, Thorne explained to Harold and Janet Hoffman during a meeting at their home in suburban Columbus. This wasn't someone who decided on impulse to leave Ohio. This was someone who spent months planning the perfect disappearance. Before we continue with these shocking revelations, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The lawyer who had processed Catherine's name change was Thomas Brennan, a civil rights attorney who specialized in helping domestic violence victims establish new identities. After initially refusing to discuss his former client due to attorney-client privilege, Brennan eventually agreed to speak with Thorne when presented with evidence that Catherine was likely dead. "She was one of the most frightened people I've ever worked with," Brennan remembered. "She paid my fees in cash and insisted on meeting only during business hours when other people were around. She kept looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to walk through the door and grab her." Brennan's files revealed the reason for Catherine's terror. She had been the victim of ongoing sexual abuse by her older brother Jeremiah, abuse that had started when she was 12 and continued until she testified against him in court when she was 17. Jeremiah had been convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he had been released in early 1985, just months before Catherine began planning her disappearance. "She told me her brother had found out where she was living and had started calling her," Brennan said. "He was making threats, telling her that he was going to make her pay for what she had done to him. She was convinced he was going to kill her." The court records from Jeremiah Hoffman's trial painted a horrific picture of systematic abuse and family dysfunction. Catherine had been the youngest of 3 children in a household dominated by an alcoholic father who refused to believe his daughter's accusations against his son. When Catherine finally found the courage to report the abuse to authorities, her own family had turned against her. Harold Hoffman had posted bond for his son and had hired an expensive defense attorney to fight the charges. Janet Hoffman had publicly supported Jeremiah, claiming that Catherine was lying to get attention. Even after Jeremiah's conviction, the family had maintained that Catherine had destroyed an innocent man's life with false accusations. "We were wrong," Harold admitted to Thorne, tears streaming down his weathered face. "God help us, we were so wrong. We chose to protect the wrong child, and we lost her forever because of it." Thorne's investigation revealed that Jeremiah Hoffman had indeed left Ohio in 1987, just months after Catherine's disappearance. Using motor vehicle records and credit reports, Thorne tracked Jeremiah's movements across several states. In 1988, he had been living in Denver and working construction jobs that required frequent travel throughout the Southwest. Most significantly, credit card records showed that Jeremiah had made purchases at gas stations along Interstate 25 and Interstate 40, the major highways that connected Denver to Arizona, during July 1988, just weeks before Catherine disappeared from Copper Ridge. When Thorne finally located Jeremiah, now using the name Jeremy Hall and living in a trailer park outside Las Vegas, the confrontation was explosive. Jeremiah initially denied any knowledge of his sister's whereabouts, but when presented with the credit card evidence, his story began to collapse. "She destroyed my life," Jeremiah finally admitted during a recorded interview. "I lost my job, my friends, my reputation. Everyone in town knew what she had accused me of. I couldn't even go to the grocery store without people staring at me and whispering." He admitted to tracking Catherine down in Arizona and calling her repeatedly in the weeks before she disappeared. "I just wanted her to admit she had lied," he claimed. "I wanted her to tell people the truth about what really happened." But when pressed for details about his trip to Arizona in 1988, Jeremiah's story became increasingly inconsistent. He claimed he had driven to Copper Ridge but had lost his nerve and returned to Colorado without ever contacting Catherine directly. "I sat in my car outside her house for hours," he said, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't bring myself to knock on the door. I knew she was afraid of me, and I didn't want to make things worse, so I just drove home." Thorne didn't believe him. The timeline was too convenient, the emotional display too calculated. But without physical evidence linking Jeremiah to his sister's disappearance, proving his involvement would be nearly impossible. Sometimes the people who claim to love us cause the most damage, and sometimes family bonds become chains that can destroy rather than protect. The truth about Catherine Hoffman's past revealed that she had been running from more than just bad memories. She had been running for her life. The abuse had started when Catherine Hoffman was 12 years old, hidden behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal middle-class home in rural Ohio. Court documents obtained by private investigator Marcus Thorne painted a horrific picture of systematic sexual violence that had continued for 5 years, enabled by a family that refused to acknowledge what was happening under their own roof. Jeremiah Hoffman had been 18 when the abuse began, old enough to understand exactly what he was doing to his younger sister. The court records from his 1985 trial included testimony that was difficult to read, even for experienced investigators like Thorne, who had seen the worst of human behavior. Catherine had endured the abuse in silence for years, believing her family's repeated message that no one would believe her if she spoke out. Jeremiah was the golden child, star athlete, honor student, popular with teachers and neighbors. Catherine was quiet and withdrawn, the kind of child adults often overlooked. The breaking point had come when Catherine was 17 and Jeremiah attempted to assault her in their parents' basement while Harold and Janet were at church. For the first time, Catherine fought back, screaming loud enough that neighbors heard the commotion. When police arrived to investigate reports of a disturbance, they found Catherine locked in a bathroom with visible injuries, and Jeremiah standing outside the door, drunk and enraged. "She's lying," had been Jeremiah's immediate response when officers questioned him. "She's always making up stories for attention. Ask anyone, she's not right in the head." But this time, physical evidence supported Catherine's account. Medical examination revealed injuries consistent with sexual assault. More damning still, investigators found a journal Catherine had been keeping for over 2 years, documenting dates, times, and specific details of her brother's attacks. The trial had torn the Hawthorne family apart. Harold and Janet initially refused to believe their daughter's accusations, convinced that Catherine was either lying or mentally unstable. They hired an expensive defense attorney for Jeremiah and publicly stood by him throughout the legal proceedings. Before we continue with this disturbing family history, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. She was completely alone, Thomas Brennan, Catherine's attorney during the name change process, told Thorne. Her own parents testified as character witnesses for her abuser. They painted her as an unstable, attention-seeking teenager who would say anything to hurt her brother. Despite the family's opposition, prosecutors pressed forward with the case. The physical evidence was compelling, and Catherine's testimony was detailed and consistent. After a 3-day trial, Jeremiah Hawthorne was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. But conviction didn't bring Catherine the justice or peace she had hoped for. Her parents blamed her for destroying their son's future and refused to speak to her after the trial. Neighbors who had known the family for years took sides, with many choosing to believe that Catherine had somehow orchestrated an elaborate deception. The community turned against her, Brennan explained. People couldn't accept that something so horrible had been happening in a family they thought they knew. It was easier to believe that the victim was lying than to face the truth about what had been going on. Catherine had been forced to drop out of high school and move in with a distant aunt in Columbus. She worked part-time jobs while finishing her education through correspondence courses, completely cut off from her family and childhood friends. The isolation and betrayal had left deep psychological scars that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her short life. Jeremiah served just over 2 years of his 3-year sentence, getting early release for good behavior in April 1985. Prison records showed that he had been a model inmate, participating in counseling programs and expressing remorse for his actions. But the remorse appeared to be calculated rather than genuine. Within months of his release, Jeremiah began systematically tracking down information about Catherine's whereabouts. He contacted her former employers, her high school, even the aunt she had been living with. When the aunt mentioned that Catherine had been talking about moving to Arizona for a fresh start, Jeremiah began researching ways to find her in the Southwest. The turning point came in 1987 when Catherine legally changed her name to Celeste Hawthorne. The process required publication of the name change in a legal newspaper, a requirement designed to notify creditors and other interested parties. Jeremiah had been monitoring these publications, and when he saw his sister's name change notice, he knew exactly where to focus his search. Credit card records obtained by Thorne showed that Jeremiah had been making purchases throughout Arizona in the summer of 1988, clearly conducting surveillance operations to locate his sister. Gas station receipts, restaurant charges, and motel stays created a clear pattern of someone methodically searching the small towns of northern Arizona. He was hunting her, Thorne concluded. This wasn't someone who accidentally ran into his sister. This was a predator who had spent months tracking down his victim. The most chilling discovery in Jeremiah's credit card records was a purchase made at Morrison's hardware store in Copper Ridge on August 13, 1988, just 1 day before Catherine disappeared. The purchase included rope, duct tape, and a large tarp. When confronted with this evidence, Jeremiah's story about losing his nerve and driving home began to fall apart completely. But he maintained his innocence, claiming that the hardware store purchase was for legitimate construction work and that he had never actually contacted his sister. The truth about family violence is that it rarely stays hidden forever. Secrets that families work desperately to protect have a way of surfacing years later, often when the damage can no longer be contained or denied. And sometimes the people who should protect us become the very ones we need protection from. The interview between Marcus Thorne and Jeremiah Hawthorne took place in a dingy conference room at the Las Vegas Police Department on October 14, 2003. Jeremiah, now 36 years old and working as a day laborer under the name Jeremy Hall, had agreed to speak with the private investigator voluntarily, but his lawyer was present and the conversation was being recorded. 15 years had not been kind to Jeremiah. Prison had left him with scars across his face from fights with other inmates. Years of manual labor and heavy drinking had aged him prematurely. His hand shook as he lit one cigarette after another, and his eyes never quite met Thorne's gaze directly. "I know why you're here," Jeremiah said before Thorne could even introduce himself. "You're working for my parents, trying to find Catherine. Well, I can't help you. I haven't seen her since before she left Ohio." Thorne spread copies of credit card statements across the table, each receipt highlighting purchases Jeremiah had made during his 1988 trip to Arizona. Gas stations in Flagstaff, a motel in Sedona, restaurants in Copper Ridge. The evidence created an undeniable timeline of surveillance and stalking. "These records show you were in Catherine's town the day before she disappeared," Thorne said calmly. "Want to explain what you were doing there?" Jeremiah's lawyer, a public defender named Patricia Walsh, advised her client not to answer specific questions about his whereabouts in 1988. But Jeremiah seemed eager to tell his version of events, as if he had been waiting 15 years for someone to ask. "She destroyed my life," he said, his voice rising with emotion. "Do you understand what it's like to have everyone you've ever known believe you're a monster? To lose your job, your friends, your whole future because of lies?" Before we continue with this crucial confrontation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Thorne let Jeremiah talk, knowing that guilty people often revealed more than they intended when they felt the need to justify their actions. The story that emerged was a disturbing mix of self-pity and barely controlled rage. According to Jeremiah, he had spent years after his release from prison trying to rebuild his life, but Catherine's accusations followed him everywhere. Employers would run background checks and find his conviction. Women he tried to date would discover his criminal record and refuse to see him again. He had been forced to leave Ohio and move from state to state, always one step ahead of his reputation. "I just wanted her to tell the truth," Jeremiah insisted. "All she had to do was admit that she had lied about what happened between us. Then people would understand that I wasn't really a criminal." Thorne pressed him for details about the Arizona trip. Jeremiah initially claimed he had been doing construction work in the area and had discovered by accident that his sister was living in Copper Ridge. But as the questioning continued, his story became increasingly elaborate and contradictory. "I called her a few times," he finally admitted. "I thought if I could just talk to her, explain how much damage she had caused, maybe she would understand. But she hung up on me every time. She wouldn't even listen." The phone calls Jeremiah described matched reports from Catherine's friend Jasmine Cooper, who had told investigators in 1988 that Catherine had been receiving disturbing calls from someone in her past. Catherine had been increasingly frightened in the weeks before her disappearance, constantly looking over her shoulder and talking about someone who had found her again. Thorne confronted Jeremiah with the hardware store receipt from August 13th, rope, duct tape, and a tarp purchased just one day before Catherine vanished. Jeremiah's explanation was rambling and desperate. "I was doing roofing work for a contractor in Flagstaff," he claimed. "That stuff was for a job site. It had nothing to do with Catherine." But when Thorne asked for the name of the contractor or documentation of the work, Jeremiah couldn't provide any details. Phone records from 1988 showed no calls to construction companies or building suppliers. His explanation simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. As the interview continued, Jeremiah's emotional state became increasingly unstable. He alternated between anger at his sister for ruining his life and self-pity about the consequences he had faced for his crimes. But he steadfastly maintained that he had never harmed Catherine during his 1988 trip to Arizona. "I drove to her house," he finally admitted, tears streaming down his face. I sat in my car across the street for hours, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. But I knew she was afraid of me, and I couldn't bring myself to make it worse, so I just drove home the next day. Thorne didn't believe the story for a second. The timeline was too convenient, the emotional display too calculated. But without physical evidence or witnesses placing Jeremiah at Catherine's house, proving his involvement in her disappearance would be nearly impossible. The interview ended with Jeremiah maintaining his innocence, while simultaneously revealing his obsession with his sister and his belief that she had wronged him by reporting his abuse. It was the mindset of a predator who saw himself as the victim, someone capable of justifying any action against the person who had dared to expose his crimes. Sometimes confessions reveal more about what someone didn't do than what they did. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones people tell themselves to justify the unforgivable. Detective Sarah Winters had joined the Coconino County Sheriff's Department's Cold Case Unit in January 2019, bringing with her a master's degree in forensic science and an unshakable belief that modern technology could solve crimes that had stumped investigators for decades. At 28 years old, she was young enough to have grown up with computers and DNA analysis, but experienced enough to understand that solving cold cases required more than just better equipment. The Celeste Hawthorne case landed on her desk as part of a county-wide initiative to digitize old evidence files. Thousands of documents, photographs, and physical evidence from cases dating back to the 1960s needed to be scanned, cataloged, and entered into modern computer databases. It was tedious work, but Winters approached it with the same methodical attention to detail that had made her one of the top students in her forensic science program. She had been working through boxes of evidence from 1988 when she discovered something that made her pulse quicken. Tucked inside a manila envelope marked Hawthorne Audio Evidence was a cassette tape labeled simply Anonymous Caller, 8/18/88. Detective Raymond Blackwood's case notes described the mysterious phone call he had received 3 days after Celeste's disappearance. The caller had said only 9 words. She trusted the wrong person. Check the mine. But in 1988, audio analysis technology had been primitive, and the distorted quality of the recording had made detailed examination impossible. Winters loaded the cassette into a digital conversion system and listened to the 31-year-old recording for the first time. Even through the obvious distortion, she could hear something that Blackwood's notes had missed, subtle background sounds that might provide clues about where the call had been made or who had made it. Before we continue with this technological breakthrough, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Modern audio enhancement technology was light years ahead of what had been available to investigators in 1988. Winters sent the digitized recording to the FBI's Audio Analysis Unit at Quantico, where specialists use sophisticated software to isolate different frequency ranges and remove layers of distortion that had previously masked important details. The preliminary results came back within a week, and they immediately changed Winters' understanding of the case. The background sounds on the recording weren't random noise. They were the rhythmic mechanical sounds of medical equipment. Someone had made the call while breathing through an oxygen concentrator or similar device. More significantly, the audio enhancement had revealed something that completely contradicted 3 decades of investigative assumptions. The distorted voice that everyone had believed belonged to a man was actually a woman, speaking in an artificially deepened register. Winters stared at the FBI analysis report in disbelief. For 31 years, every investigator who had worked the case had been looking for a male caller who might have information about Celeste's disappearance. But the caller had been a woman, possibly the person responsible for Celeste's disappearance rather than a witness to it. She immediately called retired Detective Blackwood, now 78 years old and living in a senior community in Phoenix. The news left him speechless for several minutes. "A woman?" Blackwood finally managed. "All these years, I was looking for a man. We all were. How could we have missed something so fundamental?" Winters spent the next several weeks re-examining every aspect of the original investigation through the lens of this new information. If the anonymous caller had been a woman, who among the people in Celeste's life could have had access to oxygen equipment in 1988? The answer, when it came to her, was devastating in its simplicity. Margaret Holloway, the elementary school principal who had first reported Celeste missing, had suffered from severe asthma all her life. Medical records obtained through a court order showed that she had been using a portable oxygen concentrator since 1987, especially during Arizona's dusty monsoon season when her breathing problems were most severe. Margaret had also been one of the few people who had a key to Celeste's house. The school district required emergency contact information from all employees, and Celeste had listed Margaret as her local emergency contact, having no family in Arizona. The revelation forced Winters to consider an entirely different theory about what had happened on the morning of August 15, 1988. What if Celeste hadn't been abducted by a stranger or tracked down by her abusive brother? What if her disappearance had been orchestrated by someone she trusted completely, someone who had access to her home and intimate knowledge of her daily routines? Winters began researching Margaret Holloway's background with the same intensity that previous investigators had focused on potential suspects. What she found raised even more disturbing questions about the beloved elementary school principal. Financial records showed that Margaret had been experiencing severe money problems in 1988. Her medical bills for asthma treatment were enormous, and she had been borrowing heavily against her home and retirement savings. More troubling still, there were irregularities in the school district's financial records during the years Margaret had served as principal. A forensic accounting review revealed that Margaret had been systematically embezzling money from the district since 1985, using her position to redirect funds meant for educational supplies and activities into accounts she controlled. The theft totaled over $200,000 by 1988, a fortune for someone earning a teacher's salary in rural Arizona. The most damning discovery came when Winters examined the timeline of Margaret's embezzlement activities. The thefts had accelerated dramatically in the months before Celeste's disappearance, suggesting that Margaret was either becoming more desperate or more confident in her ability to avoid detection. Had Celeste discovered the embezzlement? Had she confronted Margaret about the missing money? The school's financial records would have been accessible to Celeste in her role as a teacher, especially if she had been helping Margaret prepare budget reports for the new school year. Winters realized she was looking at a completely different motive for Celeste's disappearance. Not revenge by an abusive family member, but silencing by someone who had been stealing from the community and couldn't afford to be exposed. The anonymous phone call took on a sinister new meaning when viewed through this lens. Margaret hadn't been providing a tip to help the investigation. She had been deliberately misdirecting it, sending searchers toward the dangerous mines while keeping suspicion away from herself. For 31 years, Margaret Holloway had been viewed as a grieving educator who had lost a promising young teacher. But the evidence was mounting that she had actually been the architect of Celeste's disappearance, someone who had used her position of trust to commit the perfect crime. Technology had finally awakened the past, and the truth it revealed was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who betray us most completely, and sometimes justice waits decades for the right moment to surface. The FBI Audio Analysis Unit's final report arrived on Detective Sarah Winters' desk on a cold February morning in 2019, 3 weeks after she had submitted the digitized recording of the anonymous phone call. The 20-page technical document was filled with frequency charts, waveform analysis, and acoustic terminology that would have been meaningless to most people. But to Winters, it read like a roadmap to solving the most frustrating cold case in Coconino County history. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the FBI's senior audio forensics specialist, had included a personal note with the technical report. "This is one of the most interesting cases I've worked on in 15 years. The caller went to extraordinary lengths to disguise their voice, but modern analysis techniques have revealed details that would have been impossible to detect in 1988. The key breakthrough was in the background audio. What investigators in 1988 had dismissed as phone line static was actually the rhythmic mechanical sound of medical equipment, specifically the cycling pattern of a portable oxygen concentrator. The FBI's equipment had been able to isolate and enhance these sounds, revealing the distinctive acoustic signature of a Respironics Everflow concentrator, a model that had been widely prescribed for severe asthma patients in the late 1980s. More shocking still was the analysis of the voice itself. Using advanced frequency separation techniques, Dr. Rodriguez had been able to strip away layers of artificial distortion to reveal the caller's natural speech patterns. The voice that Detective Blackwood and every subsequent investigator had assumed belonged to a man was actually a woman speaking in an unnaturally low register. The caller was deliberately deepening their voice while simultaneously speaking through or near oxygen equipment, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her summary. The combination of these factors created a distortion that would have made gender identification nearly impossible using 1988 technology. But the underlying vocal characteristics, resonance patterns, breath control, certain consonant pronunciations are distinctly female. Winters read the report 3 times before calling retired Detective Blackwood. She needed to be absolutely certain of what she was seeing before sharing information that would fundamentally change how everyone understood the case. Blackwood answered on the second ring, his voice still sharp despite his 78 years. "Sarah, what's going on? You sounded urgent when you left that message." "Ray, I need you to sit down. The FBI analysis of that anonymous phone call, it's going to change everything we thought we knew about this case. Before we continue with this game-changing revelation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update." There was silence on the line for several seconds after Winters explained the FBI's findings. When Blackwood finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "A woman. All these years, every tip we followed, every suspect we investigated, we were looking for a man. How could I have been so wrong?" "It wasn't your fault," Winters assured him. "The technology just wasn't available then. But this changes our entire suspect pool. We need to look at every woman who had contact with Celeste, especially anyone who might have been using oxygen equipment in 1988. Blackwood was quiet for another long moment. Winters could almost hear him thinking through 3 decades of investigative assumptions that were suddenly obsolete. "Margaret Holloway," he said finally, "the principal. She had severe asthma, used one of those portable oxygen machines. I remember seeing it in her office during interviews." "That's exactly who I was thinking of," Winters confirmed. "She also had a key to Celeste's house and was the first person to report her missing. Ray, what if we've been looking at this completely backwards? The possibility that Margaret Holloway, the respected educator who had organized search efforts and spoken so passionately about bringing Celeste home, might have been responsible for her disappearance was almost too shocking to consider. For 31 years, Margaret had been viewed as one of the victims of the tragedy, a dedicated principal who had lost a talented teacher. But as Winters began re-examining the case files with this new perspective, disturbing patterns emerged. Margaret had been remarkably quick to assume that Celeste had been abducted or met with foul play, even though there was no evidence of violence at the scene. She had immediately organized massive search efforts focused on remote areas of the desert, directing volunteers away from the town and the school. Most significantly, Margaret had been the one to suggest that the anonymous caller might be Celeste's abusive brother, a theory that had dominated the investigation for years and led to countless hours spent tracking Jeremiah Hoffman's movements. She controlled the narrative from the very beginning, Winters realized, as she reviewed Margaret's statements to police and media interviews. Every major theory about what happened to Celeste can be traced back to suggestions Margaret made to investigators. The financial irregularities Winters had discovered in the school district's records took on new significance when viewed through this lens. If Celeste had discovered Margaret's embezzlement scheme and threatened to expose it, that would provide a powerful motive for murder. Margaret couldn't afford to be exposed, not just because of the criminal charges she would face, but because the loss of her position and reputation would have made it impossible to pay for the expensive medical treatments her severe asthma required. Winters called the Maricopa County Records Office to request Margaret Holloway's current address. What she learned was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Margaret was now 82 years old and living in the Golden Years Memory Care Facility in Phoenix, suffering from advanced dementia. The race against time had suddenly become much more urgent. If Margaret was responsible for Celeste's disappearance, her failing memory might soon make it impossible to get answers about what had really happened in 1988. Winters made an appointment to visit Margaret the following week, but she spent the intervening days preparing meticulously for what might be her only chance to solve the case. She reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every detail that might help her break through 3 decades of carefully constructed lies. The anonymous phone call took on an entirely different meaning when viewed as misdirection rather than a genuine tip. She trusted the wrong person. Check the mine. The statement was true. Celeste had trusted the wrong person. But it wasn't a helpful witness providing a clue, it was the perpetrator herself, deliberately sending investigators toward the dangerous mine shafts while keeping suspicion away from the school and everyone connected to it. Margaret's oxygen equipment had provided the perfect way to disguise her voice, while her position as principal had given her intimate knowledge of police procedures and search protocols. She had been able to manipulate the investigation from the inside, always staying one step ahead of suspicion while presenting herself as a grieving educator, desperate to find her missing teacher. The realization that they had been chasing the wrong suspect for over 3 decades was humbling for everyone who had worked the case, but it was also energizing. For the first time since 1988, investigators had a clear theory about what had happened to Celeste Hawthorne and who was responsible. The voice in the darkness had finally revealed its secret. Now the challenge was proving what they suspected and finding out where Celeste's body had been hidden for 31 years. Sometimes our most fundamental assumptions blind us to obvious truths that are hiding in plain sight. And sometimes the people who seem most eager to help solve a crime are the ones who committed it in the first place. The Golden Years Memory Care Facility in Phoenix looked like any other upscale nursing home from the outside. Manicured landscaping, cheerful paint colors, and inspirational quotes about growing older gracefully painted on the walls. But Detective Sarah Winters knew that inside those walls lived people whose memories were disappearing piece by piece, taking their secrets with them into the darkness of dementia. Margaret Holloway was in the advanced care wing, where residents required constant supervision and assistance with basic daily activities. At 82, she was a shadow of the energetic principal who had once commanded respect throughout Copper Ridge. Severe asthma had left her dependent on oxygen equipment 24 hours a day, and dementia had stolen most of her connection to the present. Winters had spent days preparing for this interview, knowing it might be her only chance to get answers about Celeste Hawthorne's disappearance. She had reviewed Margaret's medical records, consulted with dementia specialists about the best techniques for questioning patients with cognitive impairment, and prepared a careful strategy for approaching someone who might be a killer but was now a confused elderly woman. The facility's director, Dr. Patricia Kim, had insisted on being present during the interview to protect Margaret's rights and monitor her stress levels. Mrs. Holloway has good days and bad days, Dr. Kim explained as they walked toward Margaret's room. Today seems to be somewhere in between. She might remember things from 30 years ago more clearly than what she had for breakfast this morning. Margaret's room was filled with watercolor paintings that covered every available wall space. Desert landscapes, mountain scenes, portraits of children. The artwork was surprisingly sophisticated, showing real talent and attention to detail. but there was something unsettling about the paintings when Winters looked more closely. Many of them bore an unmistakable resemblance to the artistic style she had seen in photographs of Celeste's work. "Did Mrs. Holloway create all of these paintings?" Winters asked Dr. Kim. "Oh yes, she's quite talented. Been painting almost every day for years. She says it helps her remember happy times from her teaching career." Margaret was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, wearing a flower print dress and breathing through a nasal cannula connected to a portable oxygen concentrator. The mechanical rhythm of the machine was immediately familiar to Winters. It was the same type of background sound the FBI had identified on the 1988 anonymous phone call. Before we continue with this crucial confrontation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. "Mrs. Holloway?" Winters said gently, pulling up a chair beside the wheelchair. "My name is Sarah Winters. I'm a detective with the Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you some questions about your time as principal in Copper Ridge." Margaret turned slowly toward Winters, her eyes struggling to focus. When she spoke, her voice was weak and raspy from decades of respiratory problems. "Copper Ridge," she said slowly. "I was principal there for many years. Such wonderful children, such dedicated teachers. I'm particularly interested in talking about Celeste Hawthorne," Winters continued carefully. "Do you remember her?" The change in Margaret's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes sharpened, and her breathing became more labored. The oxygen concentrator's rhythm seemed to accelerate as her respiratory distress increased. "Celeste," Margaret whispered, gripping the arms of her wheelchair. "She was so talented, too talented to waste away in a little school like ours." Winters felt her pulse quicken. This was the first time Margaret had spoken Celeste's name with anything other than the standard expressions of loss and grief that had characterized her public statements for 3 decades. "She was very dedicated to her students," Winters prompted. "You must have worked closely with her." "She found things," Margaret said, her voice becoming agitated. "Things that weren't her business. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand, but she wouldn't listen. She said she had a duty." Dr. Kim leaned forward, concerned about Margaret's rising stress levels. "Perhaps we should take a break." "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice suddenly stronger. "I've been carrying this for so long. She was going to destroy everything, my whole life, my reputation, the school. I couldn't let her do that." Winters's hands were shaking as she continued taking notes. After 31 years, she was finally hearing a confession. "What did Celeste find, Mrs. Holloway?" "The money," Margaret said, tears beginning to stream down her weathered face. "She found the budget discrepancies. I tried to explain about my medical bills, about how expensive the treatments were, but she didn't understand. She said she was going to report it to the district office." The truth was finally emerging like water seeping through cracked stone. Margaret had been embezzling money from the school district to pay for her medical treatments and support what Winters now realized had been a gambling addiction. Celeste had discovered the theft and threatened to expose it. "I went to her house that night," Margaret continued, her voice barely audible. "I used my emergency key. I just wanted to talk to her one more time, to make her understand what would happen to me if she reported the missing money. This was the night before she disappeared, August 14th. We argued for maybe 10 minutes. I begged her not to destroy my life, but she said she had already made up her mind. She was calling the district office in the morning." Margaret's breathing became increasingly labored as she relived the events of that night. The oxygen concentrator's mechanical rhythm provided an eerie soundtrack to her confession. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "She turned away from me, said the conversation was over. I pushed her, just trying to get her attention, but she fell and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. There was so much blood. Winters felt like she was witnessing the collapse of 31 years of carefully constructed lies. Margaret had been living with this secret for over 3 decades, maintaining the facade of a grieving educator while knowing exactly what had happened to Celeste. What did you do then? I panicked. I found a painter's tarp in her garage and wrapped her up. I knew about Devil's Throat mine from when I was a child. My father had worked those mines in the 1940s. It was so deep, so dangerous. I knew no one would ever look there. The confession was devastating in its simplicity. Margaret had used her intimate knowledge of the local geography and her position of trust within the community to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime. But Winters needed to know about the phone call that had haunted investigators for decades. Why did you call Detective Blackwood? Why send the police to the mines? Margaret looked confused for a moment, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would question that decision. I had to make sure they were looking in the right direction, she said simply. Away from me, away from the school. The mines were dangerous enough that even if they searched some of them, they'd never find the right one. Sometimes the people who seem most committed to finding the truth are the ones working hardest to conceal it. And sometimes confessions come not from guilt or remorse, but from the simple exhaustion of carrying secrets that have grown too heavy to bear alone. Margaret Holloway's confession continued to pour out like water from a broken dam. 31 years of carefully guarded secrets finally finding release in the sterile quiet of her nursing home room. Detective Sarah Winters sat transfixed as the frail elderly woman described the most horrific night of her life and the elaborate deception that had followed. I stood there looking at all that blood, Margaret whispered, her oxygen concentrator providing a mechanical rhythm to her words. Celeste was so still, so pale. I kept thinking she would wake up, that it was all some terrible nightmare. But when I checked for a pulse, there was nothing. Dr. Patricia Kim had moved closer to monitor Margaret's vital signs, concerned about the physical stress the confession was causing. But Winters couldn't stop now, not when she was finally getting answers to questions that had haunted investigators for over 3 decades. How long did you stay in the house? Winters asked gently, trying to keep Margaret focused on the specific details that would be crucial for verifying her story. Hours, Margaret replied, staring out the window as if she could see that terrible night playing out before her eyes. I sat on her couch, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I should call the police, tell them it was an accident. But who would believe me? I was the one stealing money from the school. I was the one who would benefit from her silence. The calculation in Margaret's voice was chilling. Even in the midst of what she claimed was panic and grief, she had been thinking strategically about how to protect herself from the consequences of her actions. I remembered my father talking about Devil's Throat mine when I was a child, Margaret continued. He said it was the deepest shaft in the whole area, so unstable that even experienced miners were afraid to work there. I knew if I could get Celeste's body to that mine, no one would ever find her. Before we continue with this shocking confession, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The logistics of moving a body from Celeste's house to a remote mine shaft would have been challenging for anyone, but especially for a woman in her 50s with severe respiratory problems. Winters needed to understand exactly how Margaret had managed it. I found a painter's tarp in her garage, Margaret explained, her voice growing stronger as she recalled the details. Heavy canvas, the kind artists use to protect floors. I wrapped her up as carefully as I could, like I was preparing something precious for storage. The tenderness in Margaret's voice when describing this part of the process was deeply disturbing. She spoke about handling Celeste's body with the same care she might have used to pack away valuable artwork. My car was too small, so I used the school's maintenance truck. I had keys to all the district vehicles. I drove to her house around 3 a.m. when the streets were empty, loaded her into the truck bed, and drove out to Devil's Throat. Winters made detailed notes about every aspect of Margaret's account. If the confession was accurate, there might still be evidence at the mine site that could corroborate her story. The hardest part was getting her down the shaft, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. I had to lower her with rope, bit by bit. It took me almost an hour. By the time I was finished, the sun was starting to come up. The physical demands of what Margaret was describing seemed almost impossible for someone with her health problems. But desperation and adrenaline could drive people to extraordinary feats of strength and endurance. I went home, cleaned up, and drove to school as if it was any other day, Margaret continued. When Celeste didn't show up for the staff meeting, I called her house just like I normally would. I had to act surprised when no one answered. The premeditation involved in Margaret's actions was becoming clearer with each detail. This hadn't been a simple case of panic after an accidental death. It had been a calculated murder followed by an elaborate cover-up. But Winters needed to understand the full scope of Margaret's deception. The embezzlement scheme that had motivated the murder was only part of the story. Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you about the paintings in your room. Some of them look very similar to Celeste's artistic style. Margaret's expression shifted, and for the first time during the confession, she looked genuinely ashamed. I couldn't let her talent die with her, she said quietly. Celeste was so gifted, so much more talented than anyone realized. After she was gone, I started painting in her style, trying to keep her art alive. The truth was more sinister than artistic tribute. Financial records that Winters had uncovered showed that Margaret had been selling paintings she claimed were Celeste's work to private collectors for decades, profiting from her victim's talent even after death. I told people I had found some of her paintings in the school storage room, Margaret admitted. Gallery owners in Phoenix and Sedona were interested in buying work by the missing teacher. They thought they were investing in pieces by someone who might become famous posthumously. The art forgery operation had been Margaret's way of continuing to profit from Celeste's death while maintaining her facade as a grieving educator who wanted to preserve her colleague's memory. She had essentially been living off her victim's talent for over 30 years. Did you ever feel guilty about what you had done? Winters asked. Margaret was quiet for a long time, her breathing becoming more labored as she considered the question. Every single day, she finally whispered. I see her face in my dreams. I painted those pictures because I couldn't forget her, couldn't let go of what I had taken from the world. But I also couldn't bring myself to confess, couldn't face the destruction of everything I had worked for. The psychological burden of carrying such a secret for 3 decades had clearly taken its toll on Margaret. Despite her carefully maintained public persona, she had been slowly consumed by guilt and fear of discovery. The phone call to Detective Blackwood, that was the hardest thing I ever did, Margaret said. I had to make sure the investigation stayed focused on the mines, but hearing my own voice talking about Celeste like that, pretending to have information about her death, it nearly broke me. The oxygen concentrator that had helped disguise Margaret's voice during that crucial phone call now provided the soundtrack to her confession. The same medical equipment that had enabled her crime was keeping her alive long enough to finally tell the truth. I used my breathing machine to make my voice sound different, she explained. I practiced for hours, trying to sound like a man, trying to make sure no one would recognize me. But inside, I was screaming. As Margaret's confession wound down, Winters realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the solution to a cold case, but the complete psychological breakdown of someone who had spent half her life living a lie. The respected educator, who had been viewed as a pillar of the community, had actually been a killer, an embezzler, and a forger who had manipulated an entire investigation to protect herself. But she had also been a human being, slowly destroyed by the weight of her own actions, painted into a corner by choices she could never undo. Sometimes the people we admire most are fighting battles we can't see, carrying secrets that would destroy us if we had to bear them. And sometimes confession comes not from a desire for justice, but from the simple human need to stop carrying a burden that has become too heavy to bear alone. The truth had finally emerged from the darkness, but it brought with it the devastating realization that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces in our communities. The full scope of Margaret Holloway's deception emerged over the following weeks, as Detective Sarah Winters worked with forensic accountants and art experts to trace the intricate web of lies that had supported Margaret's double life for over 3 decades. What they discovered was a criminal enterprise that went far beyond a single moment of violence, revealing systematic fraud that had exploited both public trust and private grief. Margaret's embezzlement from the Copper Ridge School District had been far more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. Using her position as principal, she had created a network of fake vendors and inflated invoices that allowed her to siphon money from educational budgets into accounts she controlled. Over the course of 13 years, she had stolen nearly $400,000, money that should have gone toward textbooks, supplies, and programs for the children she claimed to serve. But the embezzlement was only the beginning. After Celeste's death, Margaret had embarked on an even more audacious scheme, systematically forging her victims' artwork and selling it to collectors who believed they were purchasing pieces by a tragically missing artist. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, an art authentication expert from Arizona State University, spent 3 days examining the paintings in Margaret's nursing home room. Her findings were devastating for anyone who had purchased what they believed was authentic Celeste Hawthorne artwork. "These are sophisticated forgeries," Dr. Martinez explained to Winters. "The technique is competent, but there are subtle differences in brushwork and color palette that clearly indicate a different artist. More significantly, several of these paintings show artistic techniques that weren't developed until the 1990s, years after Celeste Hawthorne disappeared." Margaret had been using modern art supplies and techniques to create paintings she claimed were recovered works by her missing colleague. She had even artificially aged some pieces using techniques commonly employed by art forgers, making them appear older than they actually were. The financial records of Margaret's art sales painted a picture of calculated exploitation. Between 1990 and 2018, she had sold over 40 paintings to galleries and private collectors throughout Arizona and New Mexico, generating nearly $180,000 in income that she had never reported to tax authorities. Before we continue with these disturbing revelations, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Gallery owner Patricia Chen from Sedona had purchased 12 paintings she believed were authentic Celeste Hawthorne works over a 15-year period. The news that they were forgeries created by the victim's killer was personally devastating. Margaret presented herself as someone who wanted to preserve Celeste's artistic legacy, Chen told Winters during an emotional phone interview. She said she had found these paintings in storage at the school and wanted to make sure they were properly appreciated. "I thought I was helping honor a missing person's memory, not financing her murderer's lifestyle." The psychological manipulation involved in Margaret's art fraud was particularly cruel. She had exploited the genuine sympathy people felt for Celeste's disappearance, turning their desire to honor her memory into profit for the person who had killed her. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Margaret had been manipulating the investigation itself from the very beginning. Analysis of the anonymous tips that had been called in over the years revealed that many of them had come from Margaret, always directing attention away from herself and toward other potential suspects. Phone records from the 1990s showed that Margaret had contacted law enforcement agencies in multiple states, providing false information about alleged sightings of Celeste in locations hundreds of miles from Arizona. She had also been the source of several tips suggesting that Celeste's abusive brother Jeremiah was responsible for her disappearance. She was playing a chess game with the entire investigation, Winters realized as she reviewed the pattern of misdirection. Every time investigators seemed to be running out of leads, Margaret would provide just enough new information to keep them focused on the wrong suspects. The most chilling aspect of Margaret's deception was how she had used her position as the person who discovered Celeste missing to deflect suspicion from herself. For 31 years, she had been viewed as the last person who would have harmed Celeste, precisely because she had been the one to report her disappearance and organize the massive search effort. Dr. Patricia Kim, the nursing home director, had been deeply shaken by Margaret's confession and the revelation of her crimes. "She always talked about her teaching career with such pride," Dr. Kim said. "She presented herself as someone who had dedicated her life to children and education." To learn that she had been stealing from schools and living off the death of a colleague, it's almost impossible to process. The impact on the Copper Ridge community was equally devastating. Former students, parents, and colleagues struggled to reconcile their memories of the respected principal with the reality of what she had done. Many felt betrayed not just by Margaret's crimes, but by their own inability to see through her deception. Vernon Kestrel, Celeste's former landlord, was now 87 years old and living in a retirement community near Flagstaff. When Winters called to inform him of Margaret's confession, he was silent for several minutes. "I trusted her," he finally said, his voice breaking. "When Celeste went missing, Margaret was the one who organized the search parties, who kept everyone motivated when we wanted to give up. She stood in my living room and promised me we'd find Celeste and bring her home. All that time she knew exactly where that poor girl was." The financial institutions that had processed Margaret's art sales were facing potential civil lawsuits from collectors who had unknowingly purchased forgeries. Several galleries were offering to buy back paintings they had sold as authentic Celeste Hawthorne works, but the monetary losses paled in comparison to the emotional trauma of learning they had been financing a killer's lifestyle. Perhaps most tragically, Margaret's crimes had robbed the world of Celeste's genuine artistic talent. The young teacher had been developing a unique style that blended traditional landscape techniques with bold, modern color choices. Her authentic paintings, recovered from her house and authenticated by experts, showed an artist who was just beginning to find her voice. She could have become something special, Dr. Martinez said, after examining Celeste's authentic work. Her technique was already impressive at 23, and you can see the beginnings of a really distinctive artistic vision. We'll never know what she might have created if she had lived. Margaret Holloway had not only taken Celeste's life, she had stolen her artistic legacy, profiting from her victim's talent while denying the world the opportunity to see what that talent might have become. Sometimes, the greatest crimes are not just the immediate harm they cause, but the future possibilities they destroy forever. The recovery expedition to Devil's Throat Mine required 3 weeks of planning and coordination between multiple agencies. Located 15 miles southeast of Copper Ridge, in a section of desert so remote that GPS signals were unreliable, the mine had been considered too dangerous for the original search teams in 1988. Now, with Margaret Holloway's detailed confession providing a roadmap to Celeste's final resting place, authorities had no choice but to attempt the treacherous descent. Captain Mike Rodriguez, the same Phoenix Fire Department specialist who had led the original mine searches 31 years earlier, came out of retirement to oversee the recovery operation. At 68, he was older and more cautious than he had been in 1988, but his expertise in underground rescue operations was unmatched in Arizona. "This is the deepest, most unstable shaft we've ever attempted to work," Rodriguez explained to the assembled team of specialists. "Devil's Throat goes down over 200 feet, and the walls are fractured limestone that could collapse if we look at it wrong. We're going to have one chance to do this right." The recovery team included structural engineers, medical examiners, crime scene technicians, and specialized equipment operators. The cost of the operation was enormous, but Coconino County officials had approved the expense unanimously. After 31 years, they finally had a real chance to bring Celeste Hawthorne home. Before we continue with this dangerous recovery mission, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The approach to Devil's Throat Mine required a 2-mile hike across terrain so rough that all equipment had to be carried by hand or transported using all-terrain vehicles. The mine entrance was hidden in a narrow canyon between towering red rock formations, invisible from any road or hiking trail. It was the perfect place to dispose of a body if you wanted it never to be found. The shaft opening was partially concealed by decades of accumulated debris. Tumbleweeds, fallen rocks, and the rusted remains of mining equipment that had been abandoned when the site was deemed too dangerous to work. Even with modern safety equipment, the descent would be extraordinarily risky. According to Mrs. Holloway's statement, she lowered the body approximately 150 feet down before the shaft opened into a chamber. Detective Sarah Winters briefed the team. She said she used rope from the hardware store purchase we documented, rope that should still be down there if her story is accurate. The first phase of the operation involved installing a steel framework over the mine opening to support the winch system that would lower team members into the shaft. Engineers used ground-penetrating radar to assess the stability of the surrounding rock, identifying the safest anchor points for the complex rigging system. Dr. Amanda Foster, the medical examiner who would be responsible for recovering any remains, had worked dozens of challenging recovery operations during her 15-year career, but she had never attempted to recover a body that had been underground for over 3 decades. After 31 years, we're likely to find skeletal remains, possibly some preserved soft tissue depending on the environmental conditions down there, Dr. Foster explained to the team. The painter's tarp Mrs. Holloway mentioned might have provided some protection, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that decomposition and animal activity have scattered whatever remains exist. The actual descent began at dawn on March 15, 2019, exactly 31 years and 7 months after Celeste Hawthorne had disappeared. Rodriguez and crime scene technician David Chen were the first to go down, their descent illuminated by powerful LED lights that revealed the shaft's terrifying depth and instability. The walls of Devil's Throat were scarred with tool marks from the original miners, but decades of erosion had left them cracked and unstable. Loose rock cascaded down the shaft as the recovery team descended, each piece reminding them how dangerous their mission was. At 140 feet, Rodriguez's radio crackled with static-filled excitement. "I can see something," he reported. "There's what looks like canvas or tarp material caught on a rock projection about 10 feet below my position." The blue painter's tarp was exactly where Margaret had said it would be, wrapped around what were clearly human remains. After 31 years in the dry Arizona climate, the canvas had protected the body from complete decomposition, preserving enough physical evidence to confirm both the identity of the victim and the circumstances of her death. "We've got her," Rodriguez's voice echoed up from the depths. "Celeste Hawthorne is coming home." The recovery process took 6 hours of painstaking work. Every bone, every fragment of clothing, every piece of evidence had to be photographed and documented before being carefully lifted to the surface. The rope Margaret had used to lower the body was still there, knotted exactly as she had described in her confession. Dr. Foster's preliminary examination confirmed what everyone already knew, but needed to hear officially. Dental records matched the remains to Celeste Hawthorne, and evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull was consistent with Margaret's account of the coffee table accident. But there were other discoveries that added new layers to the tragedy. Mixed in with the remains were art supplies, brushes, tubes of paint, and a small canvas that Celeste must have been planning to use for a painting. Even in death, she was surrounded by the tools of her creative passion. Vernon Kestrel, now 87 and using a wheelchair, had insisted on being present for the recovery operation despite his advanced age. When the news came that Celeste's remains had been found, he broke down completely. 31 years, he sobbed to Detective Winters. That poor girl has been down there alone for 31 years while her killer walked free and profited from her death. How do we live with that? The recovery of Celeste's remains marked the end of one of the longest-running missing person cases in Arizona history. But it also marked the beginning of a different kind of justice, the criminal prosecution of Margaret Holloway for murder, fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. As the recovery team finally emerged from Devil's Throat mine carrying Celeste's remains, the desert sunset painted the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. It was as if the landscape itself was finally releasing its hold on a secret it had guarded for over 3 decades. The truth had finally surfaced from the depths, but it brought with it the devastating confirmation that Celeste Hawthorne had spent 31 years in darkness while her killer lived in the light, celebrated as a pillar of the community. Sometimes the desert keeps its secrets for decades, but eventually every buried truth finds its way back to the surface. And sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied, it's just justice waiting for the right moment to finally be served. The investigation that followed Margaret Holloway's confession and the recovery of Celeste's remains revealed the full scope of a criminal operation that had operated in plain sight for over 3 decades. As forensic accountants, art experts, and investigators combed through Margaret's financial records and personal effects, they uncovered a web of deception so complex that it redefined how authorities understood white-collar crime in small communities. The embezzlement scheme that had motivated Celeste's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret had been systematically stealing from the Copper Ridge School District since 1983, but her methods had evolved and become more sophisticated over time. What started as simple check kiting and petty cash theft had grown into a complex network of false vendors, inflated invoices, and redirected educational grants. Financial forensics expert David Murphy had investigated hundreds of embezzlement cases during his career with the Arizona Attorney General's office, but Margaret's operation impressed him with its audacity and longevity. She was stealing from every possible source, Murphy explained to Detective Winters as they reviewed spreadsheets of fraudulent transactions. Lunch money, fundraising proceeds, federal education grants, even money from student field trips. She had been siphoning funds for 13 years before Celeste discovered her activities. The most disturbing aspect of Margaret's theft was how it had directly harmed the children she claimed to serve. Art supplies that Celeste had requisitioned for her classroom projects had never been purchased because Margaret had redirected the money into her personal accounts. Library books, playground equipment, and educational software had all been sacrificed to fund Margaret's medical treatments and gambling addiction. But the embezzlement was only part of Margaret's criminal enterprise. The art forgery operation she had conducted after Celeste's death represented a different kind of violation, the systematic exploitation of a victim's memory for profit. Before we continue exposing this criminal enterprise, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's analysis of the forged paintings revealed the calculated nature of Margaret's deception. She had not only copied Celeste's artistic style, but had created an entirely fictional body of work that she claimed represented her victim's artistic legacy. Margaret studied Celeste's authentic paintings obsessively, Dr. Martinez reported. She replicated brushwork techniques, color palettes, even the way Celeste signed her name. But she also created pieces in styles that Celeste never worked in, essentially inventing an artistic evolution that never occurred. The forged paintings had been marketed through a network of galleries and private dealers who believed they were handling authentic works by a tragically missing artist. Margaret had created detailed provenance documents, fake authentication certificates, and elaborate stories about how each painting had been discovered in storage areas at the school. Gallery owner Patricia Chen had unknowingly become Margaret's primary outlet for the forged artwork, purchasing 12 paintings over 15 years. The revelation that she had been financing a killer's lifestyle while believing she was honoring a victim's memory was devastating. She would bring in a new painting every year or two, Chen told investigators, always with a story about how she had found it in a forgotten storage room, or how a student had returned it after keeping it for years as a memento. I thought I was helping preserve the legacy of a talented young woman who had been taken too soon. The financial records of Margaret's art sales revealed the scope of her operation. Between 1990 and 2018, she had generated nearly $200,000 from the sale of forged artwork, money she used to pay for medical treatments, gambling debts, and luxury items that would have been impossible to afford on a teacher's pension. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence that Margaret had been manipulating the Celeste Hawthorne investigation itself for over 3 decades. Phone records, letters, and anonymous tips that had kept the case active for years could now be traced back to Margaret herself. She had contacted law enforcement agencies in 7 different states, providing false information about alleged sightings of Celeste in locations hundreds of miles from Arizona. She had written anonymous letters to newspapers, always directing attention towards Celeste's abusive brother or unknown transients who might have been responsible for her disappearance. She was conducting a 30-year disinformation campaign, Detective Winters realized, as she mapped out the pattern of false leads. Every time the investigation seemed to be running out of steam, Margaret would provide just enough new information to keep it alive while ensuring it never came close to the truth. The psychological analysis of Margaret's behavior painted a picture of someone who had become addicted to the attention and sympathy her role as a grieving educator provided. Dr. Michael Torres, a criminal psychologist who consulted on the case, identified classic patterns of what's known as hero syndrome. Margaret positioned herself as the person most committed to finding Celeste and preserving her memory, Dr. Torres explained. She received constant praise and admiration for her dedication to solving the case. In a way, Celeste's disappearance became the defining achievement of Margaret's life, not as the perpetrator, but as the person most devoted to seeking justice. The revelation of Margaret's true nature devastated the Copper Ridge community. Former students, parents, and colleagues struggled to reconcile their memories of the respected principal with the reality of what she had done. Many felt not just betrayed, but foolish for having been deceived for so long. Tommy Martinez, who had been one of Celeste's students and was now 42 years old with children of his own, spoke for many community members when he addressed the media. "We spent 30 years mourning Miss Hawthorne while honoring the woman who killed her," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Margaret Holloway stood in our school and gave speeches about Miss Hawthorne's dedication to children while she was stealing money that should have gone to those same children. It's a betrayal so complete that I don't know how our community will ever heal from it." The scope of Margaret's deception extended beyond financial crimes to encompass what investigators termed emotional fraud, the systematic exploitation of a community's grief and desire for justice. She had weaponized their sympathy, turning their genuine care for Celeste into a shield that protected her from suspicion. As the full extent of Margaret's double life came to light, investigators realized they were looking at one of the most complex criminal operations in Arizona history. A decades-long enterprise that had combined murder, embezzlement, fraud, and psychological manipulation into a single, devastating scheme. The woman who had been celebrated as a pillar of the community had actually been its greatest predator, hiding in plain sight while systematically destroying the trust and resources of the people who had believed in her. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who have the most to gain from our trust. And sometimes the greatest criminals are those who understand that the best hiding place is often in the spotlight of public admiration. The arrest of Margaret Holloway on March 22, 2019, 7 days after the recovery of Celeste's remains from Devil's Throat mine, presented unique challenges for law enforcement and the justice system. At 82 years old, suffering from advanced dementia and dependent on oxygen equipment for survival, Margaret was perhaps the most vulnerable murder suspect ever processed through the Coconino County criminal justice system. Detective Sarah Winters arrived at the Golden Years Memory Care Facility with a team of paramedics and legal advocates, knowing that the arrest of someone in Margaret's condition required extraordinary care and sensitivity. The woman who had orchestrated one of Arizona's most complex criminal enterprises was now a confused elderly patient who sometimes forgot her own name. Dr. Patricia Kim, the facility director, had spent the week since Margaret's confession consulting with medical experts and legal authorities about how to proceed. Mrs. Holloway's cognitive decline has accelerated rapidly since she gave her statement, Dr. Kim explained to Winters. Some days she doesn't remember the confession at all. Other days she seems to understand exactly what's happening and becomes extremely agitated. The legal questions surrounding Margaret's arrest were unprecedented. Could someone with advanced dementia be held criminally responsible for crimes they could no longer fully comprehend? How could the justice system balance the need for accountability with the reality of Margaret's deteriorating mental and physical condition? Coconino County District Attorney Rebecca Stone had wrestled with these questions for days before deciding to move forward with charges. The severity of these crimes and their impact on the community demand prosecution, Stone announced at a press conference. Mrs. Holloway was mentally competent when she committed these acts, and the fact that she has since developed dementia doesn't erase the harm she caused or the justice that's owed to her victims. Before we continue with this complex legal situation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The charges against Margaret were extensive: second-degree murder in the death of Celeste Hawthorne, 13 counts of embezzlement totaling over $400,000, multiple counts of fraud related to the art forgery operation, and obstruction of justice for manipulating the investigation for 3 decades. If convicted on all charges, she could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret's court-appointed attorney, experienced public defender Patricia Walsh, immediately filed motions challenging her client's competency to stand trial. The legal standard for competency was clear. A defendant must understand the charges against them and be able to assist in their own defense. Margaret's advanced dementia made both requirements questionable. "My client is an 82-year-old woman who sometimes doesn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror," Walsh argued during the first competency hearing. "She can't remember what she had for breakfast, let alone assist in developing a defense strategy for crimes allegedly committed over 30 years ago." The competency evaluation process took 6 weeks and involved multiple psychiatric experts examining Margaret's mental state. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, a forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience evaluating elderly defendants, conducted extensive testing to determine Margaret's cognitive abilities. "Mrs. Holloway shows classic signs of moderate to severe dementia," Dr. Rodriguez reported to the court. "Her short-term memory is severely impaired, and she has significant confusion about time and place. However, she retains some awareness of the legal proceedings and can still articulate basic facts about her past actions." The community reaction to Margaret's prosecution was deeply divided. Many residents of Copper Ridge felt that justice demanded accountability regardless of Margaret's current condition, while others questioned the morality of prosecuting someone who could no longer fully understand the proceedings against her. Vernon Kestrel, now 87 and Celeste's former landlord, spoke for many who supported the prosecution. "That woman stole 31 years from all of us," he said during a community meeting. "She made us search the desert for someone she knew was dead. She made us mourn a killer while thinking she was a hero. Her age and sickness don't change what she did." But Dr. Patricia Kim and other medical professionals raised ethical concerns about prosecuting someone with Margaret's cognitive impairment. "There's a difference between justice and vengeance," Dr. Kim argued. "Mrs. Holloway is already dying. Her dementia is a progressive disease that will kill her within a few years. What purpose does imprisoning a confused, sick, elderly woman really serve?" The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, argued that Margaret's crimes were so severe and their impact so lasting that competency issues couldn't override the need for accountability. They pointed to Margaret's detailed confession as evidence that she retained sufficient memory of her actions to participate in legal proceedings. Mrs. Holloway was able to provide specific details about the murder, the cover-up, and her subsequent crimes, Chen argued in court filings. She understood the nature of her actions when she confessed, and she maintains enough cognitive function to understand the charges against her. The case attracted national media attention as legal experts debated the broader implications of prosecuting elderly defendants with dementia. The precedent set by Margaret's case could influence how similar situations were handled across the country. Criminal justice professor Dr. Lisa Thompson from Arizona State University noted the unique aspects of the case. "We're seeing more elderly defendants as the population ages, but rarely with crimes this complex and a cover-up this extensive. The court has to balance justice for the victims with compassion for a defendant who is essentially dying of brain disease." Margaret's family, who had been estranged from her for years due to her manipulative behavior, remained divided about the prosecution. Her sister, Dorothy Walsh, no relation to her attorney, supported moving forward with the trial, while her nephew, Robert Holloway, argued for a medical placement instead of criminal prosecution. Aunt Margaret was always troubled, always manipulative, Dorothy told reporters. But what she did to that poor teacher and to the whole community was evil. The fact that she's sick now doesn't change that. The competency hearing ultimately concluded that Margaret was marginally fit to stand trial, with accommodations for her medical needs and cognitive limitations. Judge Patricia Morrison ruled that while Margaret's dementia was progressing, she retained sufficient understanding of the proceedings to participate in her defense with assistance. This court recognizes the difficult circumstances presented by the defendant's medical condition, Judge Morrison stated. However, the severity of the charges and the impact on the community require that these matters be adjudicated. The defendant will receive appropriate medical care and legal assistance throughout the proceedings. Margaret's trial was scheduled for September 2019, with special provisions for her oxygen equipment, frequent breaks for medical needs, and additional support to help her understand the proceedings. It would be one of the most unusual murder trials in Arizona history, pitting the demands of justice against the reality of human frailty and the progression of disease. Sometimes justice must be pursued even when it feels cruel, and sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that balance accountability with compassion for human suffering. The trial of Margaret Holloway began on September 16, 2019, in a Flagstaff courtroom that had been specially modified to accommodate her medical needs. Oxygen equipment hummed quietly in the background as the 82-year-old defendant sat in a wheelchair, flanked by her attorney and a full-time nurse. The same mechanical sound that had helped disguise her voice during the 1988 anonymous phone call now provided a constant reminder of her deteriorating health. Judge Patricia Morrison had implemented unprecedented accommodations for the unusual trial. Court sessions were limited to 4 hours per day to prevent Margaret from becoming too fatigued to participate. Medical personnel were on standby at all times, and frequent breaks were scheduled to allow for Margaret's care needs. Despite these measures, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that they were witnessing the prosecution of a woman who was slowly dying before their eyes. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen opened the prosecution's case with a powerful statement about justice delayed but not denied. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are about to hear about crimes so calculating and deceptive that they fooled an entire community for over 3 decades, he began. The defendant sitting before you may appear frail and confused, but the evidence will show that she was once a master manipulator who committed murder, embezzlement, and fraud, while hiding behind a facade of respectability and compassion. The prosecution's case was built around Margaret's own recorded confession, corroborated by physical evidence recovered from Devil's Throat Mine and decades of financial records that documented her criminal enterprise. Chen methodically presented evidence of Margaret's embezzlement scheme, her manipulation of the investigation, and her art forgery operation that had exploited Celeste's memory for profit. Before we continue with this historic trial, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. The most powerful moment of the prosecution's case came when they played Margaret's recorded confession from the nursing home. The jury sat in stunned silence as they heard her describe wrapping Celeste's body in a painter's top and lowering it into the mineshaft. Even though Margaret was sitting just 20 feet away, looking confused and frail, her own words painted a picture of cold calculation and deliberate deception. Dr. Amanda Foster, the medical examiner who had recovered Celeste's remains, testified about the evidence found at Devil's Throat Mine. The rope Margaret had used was still knotted exactly as she had described. The painter's tarp had preserved enough physical evidence to confirm both the victim's identity and the cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with falling and striking a coffee table corner. But it was Detective Sarah Winter's testimony about the audio analysis of the anonymous phone call that truly demonstrated the scope of Margaret's deception. When the enhanced recording was played in court, Revealing the female voice behind the distortion, several jury members visibly gasped. For the first time, they could hear the killer speaking directly to investigators while pretending to provide helpful information. The defense, led by Public Defender Patricia Walsh, faced an almost impossible task. Margaret's confession was clear and detailed, corroborated by physical evidence and financial records that spanned decades. Walsh's strategy focused on Margaret's current mental state and the question of whether prosecuting someone with advanced dementia served any meaningful purpose. "Mrs. Holloway is dying," Walsh told the jury during her opening statement. "Her brain is being destroyed by dementia, piece by piece, memory by memory. The woman who sits before you today is not the same person who committed these crimes 31 years ago. She barely remembers her own name, let alone the complex criminal enterprise the prosecution has described." Walsh called several medical experts to testify about the progression of Margaret's dementia and the ethical implications of prosecuting someone with such severe cognitive impairment. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Margaret's competency, described the defendant's confused mental state and limited understanding of the proceedings against her. "Mrs. Holloway frequently asks me why she's in court," Dr. Rodriguez testified. "She sometimes believes she's still working as a principal and asks when she can go back to school. The disease has created a situation where the defendant exists in a state of constant confusion about reality." But the prosecution countered with evidence that Margaret's confession had been lucid and detailed, suggesting that her dementia, while real, hadn't completely erased her memory of the crimes. They also argued that the severity of her actions and their lasting impact on the community demanded accountability regardless of her current condition. The testimony of community members who had been affected by Margaret's crimes was particularly compelling. Vernon Kestrel, now 87 and using a wheelchair, struggled to the witness stand to describe the 31 years of not knowing what had happened to his tenant. "She looked me in the eye and promised we'd find Celeste," Vernon testified, his voice shaking with emotion. "She organized search parties, gave interviews, acted like she cared, all while knowing exactly where that poor girl was buried." Tommy Martinez, one of Celeste's former students, testified about the impact on the school community. "We trusted Mrs. Holloway completely," he said. "She was stealing money that should have gone to art supplies for Miss Hawthorne's classroom. She was profiting from the death of the teacher we all loved while pretending to mourn her loss." The art fraud evidence was presented through the testimony of gallery owners and collectors who had unknowingly purchased forged paintings. Patricia Chen described feeling violated by Margaret's exploitation of her genuine desire to honor Celeste's memory. The most difficult moment of the trial came when Margaret herself took the stand. Her attorney had advised against it, but Margaret had insisted during one of her lucid moments that she wanted to speak. What followed was a confused, rambling account that alternated between lucid admissions of guilt and complete disorientation about where she was and why she was there. "I see her face every night," Margaret said at one point, referring to Celeste. "I painted those pictures because I couldn't forget what I had done. I couldn't let her art die with her, but I couldn't bring her back either." But minutes later, she asked the judge why she was in court and whether she would be late for school. The jury deliberated for 3 days, clearly struggling with the ethical implications of convicting someone in Margaret's condition. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with community members, media representatives, and the few remaining people who had known Celeste personally. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts," the forewoman announced. Margaret showed no reaction to the verdict, appearing confused about what was happening around her. But for many in the courtroom, the guilty verdict represented a form of closure that had been 31 years in the making. Sometimes justice comes not because it will change the past, but because acknowledging the truth is necessary for healing. And sometimes the hardest verdicts are the ones that balance accountability with the recognition of human frailty and the inevitable approach of death. Margaret Holloway, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on October 18, 2019, exactly 31 years and 2 months after Celeste Hawthorne's disappearance. Judge Patricia Morrison delivered the sentence in a courtroom filled with community members, media representatives, and the few people who still remembered Celeste as more than just a victim in a sensational crime story. The court recognizes the defendant's advanced age and deteriorating health, Judge Morrison stated. However, the calculated nature of these crimes, their devastating impact on the community, and the defendant's decades-long manipulation of the investigation require the maximum penalty under law. Margaret showed no reaction to the sentence, appearing confused about her surroundings and asking her attorney when she could go home. The woman who had once commanded respect as an educator and community leader was now a shell of her former self, her memories fading even as justice was finally being served. She was transported to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, where a special medical unit had been prepared to accommodate her needs. Prison officials had never housed an inmate with such severe dementia, requiring them to develop new protocols for managing someone who often forgot where she was and why she was there. Margaret Holloway died in prison 18 months later, on April 3, 2021, taking with her any remaining details about Celeste's final moments and the full scope of her criminal enterprise. She was 84 years old and had spent her last years in a fog of confusion, attended by nurses and guards who sometimes wondered if they were punishing a woman who could no longer remember her crimes. Before we conclude this haunting case, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future investigations into cases that demand justice, no matter how long it takes. The impact of Margaret's crimes and the resolution of the case continued to resonate through the Copper Ridge community long after her death. The elementary school underwent a complete administrative overhaul, with new financial oversight procedures designed to prevent future embezzlement. The school board established the Celeste Hawthorne Memorial Fund, using recovered money from Margaret's art fraud operation to purchase art supplies and support creative programs for students. A small memorial garden was dedicated on the school grounds in May 2021, featuring native Arizona plants and a bronze plaque with Celeste's photograph and a quote from one of her students. "She made us feel like real artists." The garden became a place where community members could reflect on the importance of truth, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the lasting impact one person can have on the lives of children. Vernon Kestrel, who had lived for 31 years wondering what happened to his tenant, died peacefully in his sleep 6 months after Margaret's sentencing. His family said he had finally found peace knowing that Celeste had been found and that justice had been served. He was buried in the Copper Ridge Cemetery, just a few rows away from where Celeste's remains were finally laid to rest. Detective Sarah Winters, whose technological breakthrough had solved the cold case, was promoted to head the county's cold case unit. She kept a photograph of Celeste Hawthorne on her desk, not as a reminder of a case solved, but as inspiration to keep fighting for other victims whose voices had been silenced, but whose stories still demanded to be told. Every cold case represents someone's loved one who deserves justice, Winters said during a training conference for law enforcement officers. Technology gives us new tools, but the most important thing is never giving up on the people who can no longer speak for themselves. The case had broader implications for how law enforcement agencies approach missing persons investigations. The FBI added the Celeste Hawthorne case to their training materials as an example of how perpetrators can manipulate investigations from within, and how modern technology can solve crimes that seemed impossible to crack using older methods. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the art expert who had exposed Margaret's forgery operation, worked with galleries and collectors to identify all the fake Celeste Hawthorne paintings that had been sold over the years. Most were returned to authorities and destroyed, but a few were preserved as evidence of how extensively Margaret had exploited her victim's memory. Celeste's authentic paintings, recovered from her house and authenticated by experts, were displayed in a permanent exhibition at the Museum of Northern Arizona. The collection showed the promise of an artist who was just beginning to find her unique voice when her life was cut short. Art critics noted the distinctive way she captured the desert light and the emotional depth she brought to seemingly simple landscape subjects. Tommy Martinez, who had been one of Celeste's students and was now a father himself, became an advocate for stronger background checks and financial oversight in school systems. "We can't let our trust in educators blind us to the possibility that some people will exploit that trust," he said. "Children deserve protection from the people who are supposed to be caring for them." The psychological impact of learning that a respected community leader had been a killer, embezzler, and manipulator continued to affect Copper Ridge residents years after the case was solved. Support groups were established for people struggling with feelings of betrayal and questions about their own judgment. Many residents reported difficulty trusting authority figures and feeling foolish for having been deceived for so long. But the case also demonstrated the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on justice. Detective Blackwood, who had carried the case with him through retirement and into his final years, lived long enough to see it solved. He died in 2022 at the age of 81, reportedly at peace knowing that his instincts about the case had been correct and that Celeste had finally been found. The story of Celeste Hawthorne became a reminder that evil often hides behind trusted faces, that justice can be delayed but not forever denied, and that communities have a responsibility to protect their most vulnerable members. Her legacy lived on not just in the memorial garden or the art exhibition, but in the renewed commitment to vigilance and accountability that her case had inspired. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the darkest chapters in our history. The case taught that truth has a way of surfacing even after decades of careful concealment, that technology can breathe new life into old investigations, and that every victim deserves to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. In the vast expanse of the Arizona desert, where secrets can be buried deep and forgotten for generations, the case of Celeste Hawthorne stood as proof that patience and determination can ultimately triumph over deception and manipulation. The desert had finally given up its secret, and justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Some voices may be silenced, but they are never truly forgotten as long as there are people willing to listen and fight for the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface.